Hello everyone, this is Thoughtful Thursdays by Tornado IP Consulting, where innovation meets strategy and intellectual property. And I'm here today with two guests, Nidhi Chaudhary and LouAnn to discuss M&A and its impact on intellectual property strategy and intellectual property in general. So Nidhi is a longtime friend who is a global HR executive and leadership coach, and she spent her career helping organizations scale across geographies, culture, and very complex business structures, both in chemical and pharma industries. She's led HR strategy for multi-billion-dollar organizations, including roles at many Fortune 500s, and has deep expertise in organizational design, talent strategy, and post-merger integration. What stands out about Nidhi's focus is her, her attention to people systems, structure, culture, and leadership. Either enable or quietly undermine value creation during transformation. Joining us also is LouAnn, who works at the intersection of strategy, execution, and governance. She specializes in helping companies scale before complexity becomes a crisis and building what she calls the operational governance spine that allows organizations to grow without breaking. Her experience spans from telecom infrastructure build-outs across Europe to leading operations for NASA satellite program and supporting over 100 organizations through transformation and post-M&A integration. So she brings a rare combination of field execution and board-level governance thinking. So each of you comes at this form at a very different angle: people, communication, and governance. What's interesting is this is exactly where intellectual property and critical knowledge either gets preserved or lost. So I have several questions, but before we dive in, I wanted to give you the opportunity to add a little bit to my introduction. Nidhi, do you have anything to add?
Well, Sylvia, you actually were very comprehensive, so really not a whole lot to add there, and just say that I've been in the HR profession, but I started my career in marketing, and so that truly laid the foundation for me to really look at things less from HR perspective and more from holistic business perspective. So that's the lens I tend to use, and I'll try to use that lens even in our conversation today.
Thank you. And LouAnn?
I think for me, like you said, you were very thorough. I think likewise with Nidhi is I have a different background. I'm an engineer by training, civil engineer, so I think about things very much in systems. And so I think that's what I bring to my work and thinking about these challenges, especially with post-merger integration.
Great. So the first question is, where does IP, intellectual property, actually get lost during M&A, and why doesn't leadership see it happening from your perspective? Nidhi, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I tend to bring a culture lens as well on many things. And as far as IP getting lost is concerned, I'm tying it back to, it being a cultural element, it being subject to or dependent on the kind of culture that the company has, both in terms of the acquiring company as well as the company that is being acquired. Because exercising discipline with the available data, maintaining confidentiality, doesn't matter which profession you belong to, whether you are an HR practitioner, legal counsel, or marketing, or just, an engineer, or an engineer who's focused on, processes and solving logical problems. It doesn't matter what you do. It's really a cultural thing. Has the company really imbibed the culture of protecting data? Because that could really make or break the company. Imagine proprietary information from R&D just in a loose conversation going out. And then in the process of acquisition, another thing happens. Imagine you don't have that cultural discipline, and then you are in the process where you are included in the team that is exploring the evaluation process, the assessment process, and you are just doing the basic foundational work, and you get the comfort that, oh, this is a team. Everybody knows everything. No, everybody doesn't know everything. You may have HR professionals, you may have engineers. Engineers might have access to proprietary information, which HR folks might not. So just because you are part of that team, you still have to make sure that you're protecting the data that you have access to because of the work that you do. So I again take it back to the discipline that is exercised as part of culture and also as part of everyday examples and training that may have been provided or not provided actually. And I think a couple of those combined together where it just makes the company more exposed to those risks. And the third element that I would say is the overall importance of protecting the data, not communicating that at a corporate level to all employees as to what really happens, what are the risks, and what is the detrimental effect of that. I think those are the things that companies undervalue and do not really channelize energy in educating their workforce. And that's where we end up losing confidential info.
What about LouAnn? What are your thoughts?
So I had a couple just to build on what Nidhi provided. I think she laid an excellent foundation. I think one is institutional knowledge, is as you're thinking about the employees and you're integrating these two companies, is understanding just maybe a lot of the kind of institutional knowledge, what really made the company what it is maybe trapped up here in certain individuals. And so not maybe fully realizing where it's at within the organization. Sometimes there's attrition after M&A, and so you're losing that key knowledge and not having that successfully thought out or captured ahead of time. And so that would be one challenge right there. The other one is building on, I think, the training, compliance, and governance that Nidhi talked about, is just also looking at it from a perspective and appreciating that maybe the company, the acquired company, or doesn't have the same approach or standards that's within the other company. And so checking or confirming that that's taking place ahead of time, or thinking that through as a potential risk of loss of IP is critical. And it extends to the people, it extends to the training, it also extends to the vendor and the tools that they're using. Could be other points where there could be weaknesses there in terms of lost data and IP.
Very true. Related question, most companies focus on legal diligence. What's the gap between legal IP protection and operational reality post-close?
I think sometimes the operational reality is the way things are really done versus what's outlined in terms of the processes and procedures that should be followed. And so it's recognizing that there's probably a gap in between and understanding what that is and what the implications are to that gap.
Just to build on to what LouAnn said, I find that most companies are, I take it back. Many companies are very good at documenting their processes, but even those companies that feel that they're diligent in documenting those processes, making it available to all of the users, potential users, sometimes fail in updating those processes. So typically, the rule of thumb is for any policy or practice to have a certain timeline, and it's normally even documented at the bottom of the document to be reviewed annually or to be reviewed every 2 years, whatever. So there is like control mechanism. And I find that even if they've gone ahead with the first step of documenting everything and training people, the follow through and that rigor, that annual discipline, again, I go back to the discipline part, sometimes companies miss that. And that then creates the gap between what is actually happening and what is actually the process. So you may have a process which is being followed only 60% because there have been a lot of updates that nobody recorded. And that's where you see the misalignment. And if you put it in terms of acquisition, well, guess what? Now you do not have updated documents, creates a boatload of work to update them before you can actually implement. So yeah, again, it goes back to the rigor and discipline.
Yeah, go ahead, LouAnn.
Well, I was just thinking on that too. I think there is regularly making sure that things are done regularly, but sometimes I think it's also recognizing that maybe they need to have those updates or that training, especially if they're not using whatever that process is consistently. If it's sporadic, maybe once a year isn't the right frequency for that. Or so making sure that there's alignment with when they need that training and they need that update and when they're actually going to use it.
I find that there's a cultural element that I've observed, that no matter what fantastic training you have and you ask people to do it regularly, the most critical piece in like proper management of IP is to have the cultural discipline where there are key stakeholders within the organizations that ensure that new people, either through or new people hired in, have those same types of practices. And are trained, because I find that a lot of the times when there's training around these kinds of topics, it's just a broad training, and it's going to be slightly different for various different technology segments and functions, and that probably shouldn't even be broadly trained. But within one piece of the organization, like I'm thinking like in manufacturing, there are certain ways of managing equipment that's proprietary equipment, like that piece of the organization needs to have some ownership, and that has to do with culture, that there are people in the organization that own that, and to make sure that the people around them have that same understanding. And I think just requirements of trainings and rules is not going to substitute for that. And
So
that
kind
is
of,
part of your institutional know-how, tying it back to the beginning, to have these key people in the room. Go ahead.
yeah. No, I was just gonna say, so ownership, like a RACI diagram, like a RACI, like who owns it, who's responsible for the updates, informing, and having that, and understanding where those are, and doing, like you're saying, perhaps a gap analysis between here's the acquired company and here's their way of doing it, and the acquiring company, and making sure that there's consistency or addressing those differences.
Right. And I think, Sylvia, if I can add to that, what you're alluding to is also the accountability piece. And that's where, accountability tied with culture and understanding the business priorities at higher levels. Because if at the higher levels, leadership understands that this is a business priority, and confidentiality of your proprietary information and data management is really important for business success, then the accountability will also be placed at the right places. And there are ways to make sure that accountability part is successful. You can tie it to performance management, you can tie it to incentive processes as well. So those things are easy to do, provided leadership understands and gives it as a priority.
Sorry, if I could just build on what Nidhi said, is making sure that leadership's involved and showing that they have an interest and that they show that this is important, I think is critical too, to making sure that this all flows through and is successful. Because if you don't have that sort of representation or visibility that leadership takes this seriously, it's not going to happen.
LouAnn, you hit the nail on the head actually. For anything, not just the topic of proprietary information and IP and all of that, to drive anything in the organization, it is very essential that there is an alignment and a buy-in from the leadership. Otherwise, nothing is going to be driven.
Absolutely. So if you had to choose speed of integration versus protection of critical knowledge, which wins and what's the real cost? And I would say answer this not, from your interpretation, but in your experience of watching these kinds of integration.
So, Sylvia, can you repeat that? You said speed of integration, and what was the other factor?
Protecting of the critical knowledge. Which one wins and what's the real cost?
Honestly, I don't think those two are mutually exclusive. Both can be done at the same time. I mean, it's just how I see it is being prepared, having a plan before you go into the integration phase. I mean, those are the things that you have detailed out, and alignment from all of the stakeholders that are involved prior to getting into the integration phase. So for me, these two should not even compete with each other. They should go hand in hand.
Right. But I would also just add, in terms of the IP involved, I think that's probably the core. One of the reasons you're acquiring the company is for the IP. So, that's the synergy. So I think that should be kind of the North Star, is to make sure that you're preserving that. But to Nidhi's point, that should be part of what you're capturing, building out, measuring that you're getting the results that you want to achieve from using that, and that should be part of the integration process.
Just thinking this in terms of the possibility, if things are going too fast, sometimes you can destroy long-term value, even if it's from the perspective of losing people. And yeah, certainly if you plan for that and you properly staff and you have a good plan on how not to do it, you could still go at a good speed. But I think the question was aiming at that element here.
So I think part of like a good integration plan, and Nidhi, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is you're doing check-ins. Like, here's the progress, here's what's happening, here's the risk. So what you've identified is here's a risk that could happen. So if there's a risk, if that's seen as something that's going to undermine the value of the effort, then I think that should be a point where you would pause and slow it down if that's what the required answer is.
Right. And I'm also curious, this is less of a response and more of a thinking out loud. And Sylvia, you can chime in, I think, a little bit better and more informed way. Even with the proprietary information, there are tiers and levels of information. And so I would imagine that there would be, like, for example, secret recipe to the sauce, right? That I would think the company would protect at all costs, because once that's gone out, then what's there to say? What business are you really trying to build? There's nothing to really build on, because now it's open to the public and anybody can make that recipe using that recipe. So LouAnn, going back to what you said, yes, I completely agree. It would depend on the kind of data that is at risk.
Again, I think in the way I'm thinking about this question, the biggest risk is in losing people from narrative and stakeholder alignment, and the messaging to the organization is the place where I could see speed losing the easiest.
Okay, so you're thinking about people who, in this example, hypothetical example, people who know the recipe, who know the secret sauce, if we lose them,
Yeah.
that is a huge risk. That is a huge risk. That is very much like trying to save your recipe as such, because now the recipe resides not just in a document, but in living beings. So you want to retain them. Of course, there are non-competes and all of those limitations and NDAs and whatnot. With the statute of limitation going 50 years, I've seen those contracts as well. But the problem with those, I'm saying that yes, that is something that the company should definitely have in place with all of the critical positions that have that knowledge, right? But that does not guarantee that the proprietary information is not going to go out, because A, it's very difficult to track that. Many times knowledge of that breach is very incidental, and then it leads into long legal battles, and sometimes you might not even have the resource to go into such legal battle, and you just lose it. So
yeah, I was just going to ask, or maybe a different slant, Sylvia. If I understood, I interpreted it a little bit differently. That you're worried about IP being, because these are key people that are leaving, not necessarily that they're going to sell the IP, but that they're just going to take their knowledge that's kind of inside their brains and walk out the door.
LouAnn, let me give an example, actually. So this is just relevant. I just was reading in The Economist. There we have nuclear submarines, right, in the United States. And to create a nuclear submarine, it requires an expert welder, because you have to know exactly how to put the pieces of metal together so when it goes down under the bottom of the ocean, it requires the expertise of a master welder. So if you're a nuclear submarine company, you do not want those people to retire before they train someone. And I think this kind of a thing might have been happening, because when I'm reading both in different parts of our industries like that, it's becoming almost impossible to recreate some of those submarines. So yeah, absolutely. These people are not going to go and work for the competitor. It's more likely they just put in their time and they are just retiring, and maybe there was no plan for replacement. And yeah, this is a huge part of the intellectual property of a company like that.
yeah, transfer of knowledge, especially that tacit knowledge where you may go do as much documentation as possible, but there is 40%. I mean, I was reading this article a long time ago because I was working with a company, and one of my key clients was the engineering function. And your comment, Sylvia, reminded me of that project I undertook. And the company formally launched a program called as knowledge transfer. And the purpose of that program was to work with these experienced people that they ranged from. You gave the example of welders. Yes, they did have some welders and some welding technology as well, which was also proprietary information for that company. The technology and the process they used was proprietary. So we launched the knowledge transfer program where we would have early career to mid-career people job shadow these experienced people who would also help them not just in documenting, but they will go around shadow them over a period of time so that they could really absorb the knowledge that is not getting documented. That is so true. I think every company should have those kind of critical positions identified and have those shadowing, because every company loses 40% of tacit knowledge every time a person retires.
Right, right.
And there's an increased risk, of course, during an M&A.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that story, Nidhi, because again, another story I read, I think this was one of the German car companies, it might have been Mercedes, was also facing this type of a problem, not because of M&A, but because people were retiring and they
Mhm.
didn't have a good succession plan in place. There were not people right behind them. So they had very creative HR approach here as well. They decided to rehire the retirees at 50%. They would only have to come in 2 days a week. They even adjusted the floor so that there's extra space and there's no slippery floor so like older people could easily work there. And this allowed them to have a mentoring program put in place where the same kind of thing you're describing, early career talent would be trained in their footsteps.
Well, that's interesting. We did something different when I started out in telecom, and we would hire retired engineers or workers from like AT&T, Verizon, and some of those to come back in. And so I'd have them along with a lot of engineers fresh out of college, and I would always pair them up to kind of get that information like you were talking about. And equally, I had something kind of similar to what Nita did, but a lot of them, you want to have a career progression, and so I had like train your replacement. So you want to progress to the next level. I need to make sure that somebody can backfill into your position. And so they, the great part was like they helped identify who would be a good person. So total comfort, and it was on them. But building in, sharing that tacit knowledge that you're talking about, and really took pride in building and developing those people. And it was just powerful to see.
Yeah, and
Let
bringing
me,
it back
but
to the original story, like this
Yeah,
is the kind of loss that you can
exactly.
experience, especially during an M&A, where like let's say there wasn't a good succession plan put in place with the company that you're acquiring, you'll be in for a surprise, and this might be some key element of a company and organizational structure that ought to be looked at in the acquisition.
Sylvia, I think usually the acquiring companies are tagging or identifying who these key people are, or they have a pretty good idea. They know it's not just they want to make sure that they do stick around because they think they recognize the value, or at least have a suspicion of what could be lost if they go out the door.
So let me put another spin to the whole topic and go outside of merger and acquisition scenario, just a regular corporation, business growth scenario. I was reading an article, and this was on LinkedIn just the other day, and I think it was written more from the perspective of equity rather than the topic that we are discussing. But ultimately, the crux of the article was that it's not about the topic was ageism. The topic was the corporations forgetting to identify the knowledge that people. This was an age-related topic, and it was on ageism. And so the article was trying to identify that corporations miss the boat when they overlook their talent that is approaching 50 plus or even in their 60s. That is a talent which has tremendous amount of experience. They are ready to deliver, and they are past for, so to say, the younger generation. And the article was talking about what a big loss because of that lack of focus. Now they don't have that excitement or motivation in the job, and so they are constructively forced out of the company because of creating that scenario for them, and they end up walking out of the organization. Ultimately, it is organizations' loss when they lose such a big wealth of knowledge. So all of this conversation just reminded me of that article, that is something that just happens as natural progression without a plan to really retain that tacit knowledge.
So who actually owns IP continuity during a merger? Because you
My
could
experience.
say legal, R&D, HR, like the different functions would know their own continuity and who are their key players. I can't imagine there's a single function in a large organization that doesn't have key players.
Well, I'll go first on
Yeah.
this, and I'll just give my take and say the famous word depends.
Yep.
Depends on the structure of the organization and who takes the ownership and where does this responsibility really sit? But here is my personal take on it. I think in an organization, the accountability or the ownership of creating policies, guidelines, training, communication, on all of that could sit with an appropriate function in the organization, fine. But as far as responsibility to maintain confidentiality and not losing that proprietary information, that sits with every part of the organization. HR owns it with all of the talent data that they have. They have to protect that and be very careful with that data. Thankfully, HR, for the most part, is really trained in every organization I've worked with. They're very regimented about it and they do proper training around it as well, most of the times. But that responsibility doesn't just end there. Every function has some proprietary information that they just need to know how to protect it. And they need to take ownership of protecting their own data.
Right. And I think you touched on it a bit, Nidhi, is it's the handoffs, it's the touch points, it's the seams between, if it's R&D, if it's legal, and if it's HR. Those are kind of maybe the weak spots that Sylvia is referring to. But I agree, it depends on the organization. But it's definitely a joint collective effort there.
So what is one decision that companies consistently get wrong in the first 90 days post-acquisition? Any thoughts on that in your experience? Some of the thoughts that I had around that is like systems consolidated too early. Talent exits are underestimated. Knowledge not mapped before org redesign.
Yep.
Kinds of things. Do you agree with those things that they might happen?
Absolutely. I think, and sometimes it's getting a little bit too ambitious. I think to your point about going too fast, sometimes they want to do that, and it's not something that's going to change overnight. So I think being realistic and not being too aggressive is where it's at, and depending upon the organization is just really appreciating, the more sophisticated groups will understand and look at culture ahead of time, but really understanding that I think circling back to what Nidhi said in the beginning, the culture has a key component, and not really fully appreciating how that's going to impact the coming together of the two organizations.
So let's wrap up with some lightning rounds. So the quick questions, and whoever wants to can take it. So the first one is most overrated focus in M&A in your experience.
Product portfolio alignment.
Most underrated risk.
Culture.
Yeah. One red flag that IP is at risk during integration. Say key experts disengaged and just being very negative. Like if I'm seeing that in like an R&D manufacturing organization, then I'm like, oh boy, this is not good. And day one action you would mandate in every acquisition.
Playbook.
Yeah.
Playbook.
Yeah.
Consistent.
Yeah.
It's such, day one is such a crazy day from the organization that if you don't have something like laid out and kind of consistently thought through in terms of going back to the ownership and who's responsible for what and how it's reporting, you're going to lose things. Things are going to fall through the cracks.
And the playbook not handed on day one. Day one playbook available much before.
Yeah, multiple playbooks there.
I think this has been really interesting. We have delved into this topic in such a different way, from this different perspective. And any last thoughts before we wrap up?
I think going back to day one is just never underestimate how important day one is, because that's the first time that the acquired company is really going to get a taste of their first introduction. Everybody's nervous, and this is the time to make that first impression and shine. And so having those playbooks that Nidhi talk about is critical.
And one thing that I would always remember and remind, don't get carried away in the loose conversations. I see a lot of damage done in the loose conversations, especially when you feel that this is done. Now I can let loose. That's where we go wrong.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the conversation, and thank you for joining us at Thoughtful Thursdays with Tornado IP.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, this was good. Thank you.